It occurred again. Jake Harper stood at the entrance of his barn, staring at the glossy white SUV, parked right in the middle of his hay storage. The absurd Karen vanity plate, shining under the afternoon sun, his right eye twitched. He took a slow, deep breath, urging himself to calm down. Not again, not this time. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh cut grass, and somewhere in the distance, his cows let out a few low mows, unaware to the injustice unfolding on their land. He reached for the barn door, yanked it open, and stared inside. Nothing had been moved, except for the towering boldness of his neighbor, who had once again claimed his barn as her personal parking area. Jake squeezed the bridge of his nose. He had warned her multiple times, but no, Karen always had an excuse. The first time she did this, it was just for a few hours while she went into town. The second time, she insisted her driveway was being sealed, and she had nowhere else to go. The third time, she had the nerve to say his barn had better shade, and she didn't want her leather seats getting too warm. And now, there was a note taped to his barn door. "Jake, I'll pick it up Monday. Don't move my car, it's new, and I don't want dust on it." He read it twice, blinking in astonishment. Monday, it was Friday. She had parked her fancy SUV in his barn and planned to leave it there for the entire weekend, like it was a reserved area at the Ritz-Carlton. Jake clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over Karen's contact, but then something halted him. He knew exactly how this would go. He would call her, and she'd answer in that high-pitched, fake, apologetic tone, acting shocked, like it was an oopsie moment. Then, she'd talk him into letting it slide again. Not this time. Jake looked at the heavy barn doors, then at the padlock hanging nearby. An idea developed in his mind, slow and sweet, like honey dripping from a spoon. He grabbed the padlock, swung the barn door shut, and secured the lock with a satisfying click. Then, whistling a tune under his breath, he walked toward his truck, tossing his weekend bag in the back. He had planned a fishing trip, and suddenly the idea of being completely unreachable for the next 2 days sounded even better. By the time he was halfway down the road, his phone vibrated. Karen. He let go to voicemail. A minute later, another call. He smirked and turned up the radio. By the time he reached the highway, she had called 5 times. An hour later, she had called 12 times. And by the time he reached his cabin, by the lake, his voicemail was full of escalating, furious messages that went something like this. "Hey Jake, it's Karen. I just realized you locked my car in your barn. Haha. Funny joke. Call me when you get this. Okay, seriously. I need my car. Unlock the barn. Jacob Harper, I know you're ignoring me. You better get back here. Right now. You think this is amusing? You are committing a crime. I will call the police." He took a sip of his beer, feet propped up on the dock, watching the sunset over the water. He couldn't remember the last time he felt this calm. The weekend passed in pure bliss. No Karen, no drama, no entitled demands, just the sound of nature, the occasional fish biting, and the knowledge that somewhere Karen was losing her mind. By the time Monday rolled around, he was almost sad to leave, almost. He pulled into his driveway to find chaos waiting for him. Karen was standing outside the barn, pacing like a caged lion, her arms flailing as she yelled into her phone. Next to her, a police car sat parked on the gravel, a bored-looking officer leaning against the hood, arms crossed. As soon as Jake stepped out of his truck, Karen charged toward him, face redder than a sunburned tomato. "There he is. Arrest him," she screeched, pointing an accusing finger. Jake blinked. For what? For stealing my car. The officer let out a sigh, rubbing his temples. "Ma'am, we already went over this. Your car is inside his barn. That's private property. He didn't steal anything. He locked it in there. That's theft." Jake looked at the officer. "So let me get this straight. I locked my own barn, which is on my own land, and now I'm being accused of crime." The officer's lip twitched, like he was trying not to smile. Jake pulled out his phone and opened his security footage app. "I have video proof. She parked there without permission. Also, here's her note." He handed over the crumpled paper. The officer took one look at it and exhaled through his nose. "Ma'am, this proves you left your car here voluntarily." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but It was just supposed to be for a little while. Jake crossed his arms. You wrote Monday. Today is Monday. The officer coughed into his fist, clearly hiding a laugh. Technically, he did exactly what you said. He didn't touch your car. Karen's face went through 6 shades of rage before she settled on self-righteous fury. This is harassment. I'll sue. Jake smirked. Go ahead, trespassing laws are pretty clear in this county. Karen let out a strangled noise, turned on her heel, and stormed toward the barn, yanking on the lock. Unlock it now. Jake took his sweet time unlocking the padlock with a casual hum. The moment the doors swung open, Karen dove for her car, yanking open the driver's door, only to find something waiting for her inside. A family of raccoons had taken up residence over the weekend. One of them hissed. Karen let out a blood-curdling scream and fell backward into a pile of hay, flailing like an upturned turtle. Jake laughed, doubling over, hands on his knees. The officer lost the battle and let out a full snort of amusement. Karen scrambled to her feet, covered in hay and indignation, shrieking, "You will pay for this." Jake wiped away a tear. Nah, I think we're even. She stomped into her car, slammed the door, and sped off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and what was left of her dignity. The officer clapped Jake on the shoulder. That was the funniest thing I've seen in years. Have a good day, Mr. Harper. Jake watched Karen's SUV disappear down the road, then turned back toward his peaceful Karen-free barn. Finally, silence. Jake woke up Monday morning, feeling more refreshed than he had in years. His weekend at the lake had been nothing short of perfect. No calls, no stress, just nature, and the satisfaction of knowing Karen was back home, fuming. The only thing sweeter than catching a base was knowing his barn had been locked tight with her precious SUV inside. He stretched, yawned, and made himself a strong cup of coffee, savoring the quiet before heading back to reality. But as soon as he pulled into his driveway, reality hit him in the form of flashing red and blue lights. Karen stood outside the barn, her arms flailing wildly as she argued with a police officer. The officer looked exhausted, as if he had been listening to the same rant for hours. Karen, on the other hand, was full of energy, her face red with rage as she pointed toward the barn, like she was presenting evidence in a high-profile trial. The moment she spotted Jake's truck, she turned on her heel and stormed toward him, nearly tripping over her own feet in the process. "There he is," she shrieked, voice cracking from overuse. "That's the man who stole my car." Jake parked, stepped out, and casually took a sip of his coffee, letting the moment linger. "Morning, officer," he greeted, ignoring Karen's murderous glare. The officer gave a tired nod. "Mr. Harper, this woman claims you locked her vehicle inside your barn, against her will." Jake took another sip, savoring the moment. "Well, I did lock my barn," he admitted, "but her vehicle, I didn't put it there, she did." Karen threw her hands in the air. "It doesn't matter. He kept me from accessing my property. That's a crime." The officer pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, did you park your car in his barn without his permission?" Karen's mouth opened and closed, her mind desperately trying to twist the situation in her favor. "That's not the point. He should have called me before locking it." Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out the note she had left on his barn door. "You said, and I quote, 'I'll pick it up Monday. Don't touch my car.'" He handed the paper to the officer. "I followed her instructions perfectly." The officer read it, his lips twitching as if he wanted to laugh, but knew he shouldn't. He turned back to Karen, who had suddenly gone silent. "Ma'am, this note makes it pretty clear you left your car here voluntarily." Karen's face twisted into something ugly. He knew, "I didn't mean leave it locked inside. No reasonable person would do that." Jake leaned against his truck. No reasonable person would treat someone else's barn like a public parking lot either. Karen let out a frustrated scream and stomped over to the barn doors, rattling them aggressively. "Well, since you're back, open it." Jake took his sweet time retrieving the key. He made sure to stretch, adjust his hat, and finish the last sip of coffee before unlocking the padlock and swinging the doors open. The moment he did, Karen lunged for her SUV, yanking the driver's door open, and then promptly let out a blood-curdling shriek that echoed across the farm. Inside her car, nestled in the passenger seat, was a fat, grumpy raccoon, blinking at the sudden invasion of light. It took one look at Karen, let out a low hiss, and scrambled toward the back, knocking over an open bag of snacks she had left inside. Another rustling sound came from the floorboard, and Karen realized in horror that it wasn't just one raccoon, it was three. She stumbled back, clutching her chest, as if she had just witnessed a murder. What is that? Jake peered inside, biting back laughter. Looks like a little family moved in over the weekend. Guess they got comfortable in your car. Karen gagged, her entire body trembling. Get them out, get them out. The officer, who had been suppressing his amusement all morning, finally broke. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Well, ma'am, that's not really a police matter. Karen whipped around to face him. You're an officer of the law. Do something. The officer smirked. Unless they stole something, I don't handle raccoons. Jake shrugged. I could get them out for you. Karen's head snapped toward him, eyes wide with hope. Yes, do that. Jake rubbed his chin, pretending to think, but I'd hate to touch your car, seeing as you were so clear about that in your note. Karen's eye twitched. I take it back, just get them out. Jake chuckled and strolled toward his truck, retrieving a long stick. It only took a few minutes of coaxing before the raccoons scurried out, one by one, disappearing into the nearby trees. The last one, the largest of the bunch, took its time, pausing on the driver's seat to stare Karen down before finally jumping out and waddling away. Karen shuddered, like she could still feel their presence. Once the car was empty, Karen shot Jake a death glare. You did this on purpose. Jake raised an eyebrow. How exactly did I train wild raccoons to move into your car? Karen had no answer for that, but her hatred burned brighter than the sun. She yanked open the car door, climbed inside, and then immediately screamed again. Jake stepped closer, amused. Now what? Karen threw herself out of the car, holding up her hands, which were now covered in raccoon footprints and what looked suspiciously like chewed-up granola bar crumbs. They ruined my interior. Jake peered inside and whistled. The raccoons had clearly made themselves at home. There were tiny muddy paw prints on the seats, torn-up napkins scattered everywhere, and a distinct smell that suggested they had possibly used the floorboard as a temporary bathroom. Yikes, Jake said, shaking his head. Gonna need more than an air freshener for that. Karen was shaking with rage. You think this is funny? Jake tilted his head. A little bit, yeah. Karen let out an incoherent screech, spun around, and stormed toward her car. I'm taking this to court. You'll regret this. Jake watched her drive off, still chuckling, as the officer shook his head. I've been a cop for 15 years, the man said. That might be the funniest thing I've ever seen. Jake smirked. She had it coming. The officer clapped him on the back. Well, she might try to file some kind of complaint, but I doubt it'll go anywhere. You technically did nothing wrong. Jake nodded. Good to know. As the officer drove off, Jake turned back toward his barn, finally able to enjoy the peaceful morning again. He inhaled the fresh air, took in the sight of his farm, and relished the newfound silence. For the first time in a long time, there was no sign of Karen, and that, more than anything, made this the best Monday he'd had in years. Jake had barely settled into his usual morning routine when his phone buzzed again. He knew who it was before he even looked. Karen. He sighed, debating whether to ignore it, but curiosity got the best of him. He swiped to answer, bracing himself. You're going to pay for what you did, Karen hissed, her voice sharp as barbed wire. Jake took his time, stirring his coffee. Morning, Karen. Hope your drive was pleasant. You ruined my car. Jake sipped his coffee, letting her rage run its course. I didn't ruin anything. Nature just took its course. Karen let out a noise, somewhere between a growl and a shriek. I have filed a formal complaint against you. You think you're so clever, but the law is on my side. Jake leaned back in his chair, watching the sunrise over his field. That's so. Oh, you'll see, she snapped. Enjoy your last few days of freedom, because you'll be hearing from my lawyer soon. Jake hung up before she could say another word. He had no time for whatever nonsense Karen was brewing. But as he looked toward the town in the distance, he had a feeling things were about to get interesting. Sure enough, 2 days later, he received an official-looking letter in the mail. It was from a law office. Karen had actually followed through. Jake opened it, half expecting some outrageous demands, and he wasn't disappointed. She was suing him for emotional distress, unlawful imprisonment of her vehicle, and damages to personal property. She demanded $50,000 in compensation. Jake burst out laughing. He tossed the letter onto the kitchen table and poured himself another cup of coffee. He wasn't a legal expert, but he knew nonsense when he saw it. The only thing Karen had was nerve. Still, he decided to show up to the hearing just for the entertainment value. The courthouse was a small one, typical for their town. When Jake arrived, he spotted Karen standing outside, arms crossed, looking smug. She was dressed as if she was about to give a press conference, her suit unnecessarily dramatic for such a ridiculous case. "You finally came to your senses," she sneered as he walked past. Jake chuckled. "I just wouldn't miss this show for the world." Inside, the judge took his seat, looking mildly annoyed before the case even started. Karen wasted no time launching into her exaggerated sob story. "Your Honor, I have suffered severe trauma because of this man's actions," she began dramatically. "Not only did he imprison my car, but he intentionally trapped wild, disease-ridden animals inside to cause destruction. I have had nightmares. I have suffered great emotional damage, and my car is ruined beyond repair." Jake had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. The judge looked at Karen over the rim of his glasses. "Miss Thompson, do you have evidence that Mr. Harper placed the animals inside your car?" Karen faltered for a moment, then quickly regained her composure. "The circumstances make it obvious. He locked the barn, knowing my car was inside. The raccoons wouldn't have been there if it wasn't for him." The judge turned to Jake. "Mr. Harper, do you have any evidence to support your side?" Jake pulled out his phone and played the security footage from his barn. The judge leaned forward, watching as the video clearly showed Karen parking her own car, leaving the note, and walking away. Then came the best part. The video caught the exact moment the raccoons crawled through an open window, sniffing around before making themselves at home. Karen's face paled as she watched the screen. The judge sat back in his chair, unimpressed. "Miss Thompson, I see no foul play here. Mr. Harper did not steal or damage your vehicle. In fact, this footage proves that the raccoons entered of their own accord." Karen's jaw tightened, but he still locked the barn. The judge sighed, which he had every right to do. It's his property. Karen's face twisted into a scowl. "This is ridiculous. He knew it would inconvenience me." The judge gave her a long, tired look. "You trespassed, Miss Thompson. If anything, you're the one who should be facing legal consequences." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, the door to the courtroom swung open. Everyone turned as a man stepped inside, Greg Thompson, Karen's husband. His face was unreadable as he walked toward the judge. "I'd like to say something," he announced. Karen froze. "Greg, what are you doing here?" Greg ignored her, handing a folder to the judge. "I have some information that might be relevant to this case." The judge opened the folder and skimmed through the pages. Jake watched as Karen's smug expression melted into panic. Greg crossed his arms. "Karen doesn't own that car, I do." The courtroom fell silent. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. "She took my SUV without permission," Greg continued, "and she's been doing stuff like this for years. Entitlement, boundary pushing, lying. This is just another example. I thought it was time someone finally put a stop to it." Karen looked like she'd been slapped. "You traitor." Greg shrugged. "I'm just tired cleaning up your messes." The judge nodded slowly, setting the folder aside. "Well, that certainly changes things." The next few minutes were a blur of legal formalities, but when the gavel finally struck, the case was dismissed. Karen's ridiculous lawsuit had been thrown out completely. She sat in stunned silence as the realization sank in. Jake got up, tipping his hat at her. "Good luck with that emotional distress." Karen sputtered as he walked away, but nothing she said mattered anymore. The case was dead, and her reputation ruined.